Trump's open defiance of the Supreme Court really was a turning point for America. And to see this administration unequivocally refuse to comply with a 9-0 Supreme Court decision where there's no ambiguity is genuinely shocking to witness, even if we all expected this. And it marks the beginning of a new era in American history where we are no longer a flawed liberal democracy. Those days are behind us. We're now arguably in a liberal regime where civil liberties are no longer upheld and the rule of law is effectively null and void. And sure, we still have democratic institutions, but they don't protect us from abuses of power because those protections that we're theoretically supposed to have aren't being enforced. And it seems like everybody today is just trying to digest this new reality, because I think that if it wasn't clear to people before, that Oval Office meeting with Trump and Bukele made it clear. And I want to show you what some people are saying. In an op-ed for Common Dreams, Tom Hartman warns that the next person in a cell with no charge could be you. And he argues that Trump's defiance of the Supreme Court, as well as his violation of Kilmar Abrigo Garcia's civil liberties, represents the official death of American democracy. And in a Substack post, fascist historian Timothy Snyder says, this is the beginning of an American policy on state terror. And for those who don't know, Timothy Snyder is the author of On Tyranny, and he is one of 3 experts on fascism who recently announced that he's going to be leaving the United States. And that decision has been criticized. For example, in an op-ed for The Nation, George Packer argues that fleeing the country feels like obeying in advance, which is something that Snyder himself says you shouldn't do. But at the same time, Packer sympathizes with these historians who are leaving, writing, they're fleeing America as they see it falling under an authoritarian regime. They're watching the rule of law wither and due process disappear, while a chill of fear settles over the country's most powerful law firms, universities, and media owners. They're getting out while they can. And Packer goes on to argue that it's hard to know when to get out in these types of situations, although he doesn't think that now is the time, and I think that's reasonable. I would agree with him. Nonetheless, it is alarming to see literal experts on fascism flee the country right now. But I mean, this discussion about when you should or shouldn't leave, it does feel tone deaf, admittedly, because even though it's on all of our minds, a lot of people simply won't be able to get out. If you're on disability or Social Security and you rely on the government for your livelihood, you don't really have a choice. You've got to stay. If you can't find a new job abroad, you're kind of stuck here too. And the overwhelming majority of Americans aren't going to be able to leave if and when shit really hits the fan. So I feel like at this point it makes sense to just assume that we're all going to stay. And with that in mind, we should mentally prepare ourselves for whatever comes next and try to do our best to survive. You know, there are citizens around the world who grew up in authoritarian regimes, and it's all that they know. So sure, it's going to be an adjustment period for us in America who have known liberal democracy, at least a flawed one, forever, but it's not necessarily a death sentence. And the fact that I can still make videos criticizing Donald Trump and you can still post memes about him on social media, that is a sign that not all hope is lost, at least yet. But going back to Snyder's warning about this being the beginning of an era of American state terror, that is something that is significant, and I want to talk about what he means by that and why he thinks we're in that era now. He writes, the control of language is necessary to undermine a legal or constitutional order. Our rule of law begins with notions such as the people and their rights. If politicians shift the framework to criminals and terrorism, then they are shifting the purpose of the state. In the United States, we are governed by the Constitution. Basic to the Constitution is habeas corpus, the notion that the government cannot seize your body without a legal justification for doing so. If that does not hold, then nothing else does. If we have the law, then violence may not be committed by one person against another on the basis of name-calling or strong feelings. This applies to everyone, above all to the president, whose constitutional function is to enforce the laws. Trump spoke of asking Attorney General Pam Bondi to find legal ways to abduct Americans and leave them in foreign concentration camps. But by legal, what is meant are ways of escaping the law, not applying it. It is that anti-constitutional escapism that enables abuse. State terror involves not just the malignant development of state organs of oppression, such as masked men and black vans, but also the withdrawal of the state from its role as guardian of law. And there's a lot to unpack there, so let's break it down. So the pre-existing framework that we had of habeas corpus and the presumption of innocence have already been replaced, both through the language that the Trump administration uses to describe their victims as terrorists and whatnot, and by their violation of laws, as well as their refusal to uphold laws. In other words, there's an obvious contradiction here, right? On one hand, the Trump administration is powerful enough to break the law and illegally deport Abrigo Garcia, for example, in defiance of a court order, yet they're supposedly not powerful enough to bring him back. This is the essence of state terror. All of it. It's an indication that the civil liberties that once protected us are no longer in effect. And we're all now subject to the whims of whatever the Trump administration wants. Sure, you technically have First, Fourth, Fifth, Sixth, and Eighth Amendment protections, but if the government isn't going to enforce the Constitution and protect the law and uphold them, then those rights aren't going to make a difference. So we've transitioned from law and order to what Snyder calls an escape from law and order. And from there, the escape from law devolves into coercion, i.e. state terror, and we've now reached that point where coercion has replaced our system of law and order. Now, Snyder argues, quote, "In the history of state terror, the escape from law into coercion takes three forms, all of which were on display incipiently in the White House yesterday: the leader principle, the state of exception, and the zone of statelessness." So let's take some time to talk through these three principles, because I think that if you understand what they mean and how they apply to Donald Trump, it's going to be evident that what Timothy is saying here is valid. So the first is the leadership principle, which just means that everything the leader does is by definition good, according to the leader, of course, because the leader purports to represent the people. I mean, this is Donald Trump. He explicitly tweeted this, basically. He said something to the effect of, "He who saves his country violates no laws." I mean, that's the exact same rationale used by every dictator ever, and Trump is doing that. Now, the second principle is the state of exception, which means that the administration makes exceptions to justify their abuses of power. I mean, this is exactly what Donald Trump has been doing since day one. He's deporting people under the Alien Enemies Act of 1798 because there's supposedly an invasion of gang members, therefore we're at war. Therefore, he can use that wartime law to deport people and deny them due process. He also wants to find ways to legally send Americans to foreign gulags because they're the most hardened criminals ever. Mahmoud Khalil doesn't get First or Sixth Amendment protections because he's not a citizen. Doge can illegally access your data because they're rooting out fraud. AP can be denied press credentials in spite of a court order saying that they have to give them to them because they're biased. I mean, the pattern of exceptions that they continuously carve out to justify their lawbreaking is one way that they engage in coercion. And the third and final principle is the zone of statelessness, which is where the state physically moves people to different areas where domestic laws don't apply. Think Gitmo, think El Salvador. And Snyder goes on to argue that if the public accepts these three principles and they buy the bullshit that Trump is selling, that rationalizes state terror against immigrants, it can and will be used against citizens too. And since Trump is already talking about sending homegrowns, i.e. citizens, to foreign gulags, that's a sign that we are in the era of state terror, which is common in all authoritarian regimes, where they use the state to coerce their own citizens, albeit to varying degrees. And I think that this is something that people around the world looking out, they already can intuitively sense. I mean, tourism from Europe, for example, has collapsed since Donald Trump took office, presumably because citizens in other countries no longer have confidence that democratic norms will protect them when they visit us. And I mean, who can blame them? When you have Canadian actresses and German nationals being detained by ICE, people around the world won't feel safe traveling here. Nobody wants to visit a country that's in the middle of throwing students into black vans and deporting green card holders for criticizing Israel. I mean, just yesterday, Mohsen Madawi, a Colombia student protest leader, was arrested by ICE after he was called in for a citizenship interview. On top of that, Newsweek reports that a 19-year-old named Merwil Gutierrez was mistakenly arrested by ICE, and even though they realized that he wasn't their target, it didn't matter. Quote, "The officers grabbed him and two other boys right at the entrance to our building," one said. "No, he's not the one," like they were looking for someone else, but the other said, "Take him anyway." Wilmer told Documented, an independent nonprofit newsroom dedicated to reporting for immigrant communities in New York City. And that young man was sent to a gulag in El Salvador where he's probably going to be for the rest of his life. Also, some ICE agents could meet their weekly quota. These people have no regard for anyone's humanity. And if they can do this to him, they could do this to you too. So the rest of the world can see what's happening. The question is, do Americans? Sometimes it's hard to be self-aware. Americans in particular have that problem. So do Americans understand the gravity of the situation? Will they continue to go on with their daily lives as if nothing is happening? Or will they inform themselves and stay engaged and condemn what's happening? That matters because how Americans respond in this era of state terror will determine how bad it's actually going to get. I mean, if you become numb or desensitized to these kidnappings and you lose your sense of outrage and stop talking about them, it's only going to get worse. I mean, we'll only be able to weather the storm, if we're going to be able to weather it at all, if we're a united front, if we show up for each other and speak out. So even though it's exhausting and depressing, you cannot check out, because if you do, the fascists win.